So, last but not least, before our round table, we have Rune Dahl Fitjar, who is a professor of innovation and the prorector for innovation and society at the University of Stavanger in Norway. He holds a doctorate in political science from the London School of Economics, and he has a wealth of research encompassing regional and innovation issues, economic geography and political science that has been published widely in journals such as Economic Geography, Research Policy, the Journal of Economic Geography, Urban Studies and Regional Studies or Geoforum. What I like particularly about Rune is that he does not just do research, he practices what he preaches, and he has been fundamental in not just transforming the University of Stavanger into a university that engages with the local community in Norway, but also in actually making a lot of his research and leading some of the debates about innovation in the case of a country that invests quite a lot of innovation in like Norway, and also gets some remarkable results, especially in comparison to other Nordic countries. But today he's going to be talking about communities under COVID-19, and the question is whether we are now returning to the national or the local scale. So, Rune, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrés. Mucho gusto estar aquí. Hubiera también querido hablar en español, pero me falta un poco el vocabulario especializado sobre esto, entonces voy a dar la lectura en inglés por la mayoría.
No, but your Spanish was amazing. You managed to hold the whole conversation at dinner last night, so...
That's easier to do, I think. So many thanks for the opportunity to talk about this. I will not present to you these kinds of rigorous empirical analysis like Oske has done, but take this more as an opportunity to give my perspective on some of the issues that we've talked about today. From my background is in political science, where I did regional political science, and then I've moved into the field of economic geography, and I'm trying here from a more theoretical perspective to combine these two different perspectives on this issue. And so this is going to be a bit speculative, a bit kind of theoretical work, but you've seen a lot of the empirics behind this discussion already today. So hopefully you will bear with me with some perspectives which are going to be a lot similar to what you've heard today, but I'm going to try also to bring in my thoughts on how COVID-19 and the pandemic has changed this dynamic between the centers and the peripheries, which is mainly what I will talk to you about. So let's see. There we go. So basically, I will talk firstly about the same issue that the others have raised. How do we interpret the rise of populism? I will then move on to this issue of cleavages and especially the center-periphery cleavage, and think more broadly about what that is, also beyond the realm of populism, and then I will discuss centers and peripheries under COVID-19 and whether the pandemic has changed anything in this relationship. I won't bore you with this. You've seen the rise of populism in Europe. What I will point you to is a little bit the subtitle of this graphic, which is how this is often perceived in the media and also by a lot of scientists, and I suppose by many in the mass public, is that this is a rise of the far right. And this is the way that we're used to talking about these issues, is that it is a far right, or as Jonathan mentioned, sometimes a far left type of movement that is arising against the system. And this is how we are then used to seeing and understanding political debates as fundamentally a battle between the left and the right politically, where we've placed in typically these traditional political movements, social democrats versus the center-right. The center-right can be liberal, conservative, Christian democratic, different kinds of parties. whereas the left is almost always associated with some kind of socialism or communism, from the social democratic parties out to the classic communist parties. And then these right-wing populist movements, so-called, come in here, and they are typically placed then on the right wing, as kind of further right than the traditional center-right parties, because that is, I guess, where we found space on this axis, and it's also where they often tend to identify themselves, because they are certainly not socialist parties, so they are often in opposition to the socialist and social democratic parties. But I mean, if you think about the left-right axis, it doesn't really fit for this phenomenon. So the left-right axis, if we try to put some word pairs on it, and I mean, left and right is a really fuzzy concept. It doesn't say anything about what these movements mean politically. Left and right is based on where the parties used to sit in the French parliament, essentially, and doesn't say anything necessarily about their politics. But typically we think about left-wing parties as being more in favor of the state, of state interventions, whereas the right are more fond of markets and market solutions to problems. We think of the left as being more in favor of the public sector spending money, the public sector solving problems, whereas the right is more in favor of the private sector, of corporations and companies. We think about the left as prioritizing equality above all. So the left's fundamental project is to create equality, economic inequalities or social inequalities that they need to address, whereas the right is about preserving individual liberties. So they tend to prioritize your freedom or your right to your own property, for instance, over equality. We tend to think about the left as prioritizing the collective over individuals, so basically redistribution over your kind of individual right to maintain your property or your income. And we tend to think about the left as being a working class movement, getting the support of working class voters, whereas the right is supported by the middle classes. Now, if we try to put what we've heard today into this, the populist right is not really associated with the right on any of these dimensions at all. They tend to oppose free trade, so they are not in favor of these kind of market integration mechanisms. They tend to put the national collective above individual rights. So it's the nations and nations' interests that is foremost, whereas it's actually the mainstream parties that are supporting individual rights in a lot of social issues, in abortion, in gay rights, etc. And they tend to have a voter base that is also more classically associated with the left, so they tend to generate a lot of support from working class voters. And this has actually created quite a lot of confusion among left-wing parties. They feel that they've kind of lost their own electorate, they've lost the support of the traditional people that supported them, and they're wondering often in many countries how should they respond to this. I would like to say that this way of understanding political debate as debates between the left and the right is fundamentally a relic of the Industrial Revolution. In the Industrial Revolution, basically, that was what created this distinction between the working classes and the capitalist classes, and between the left and the right. So all of these left-wing movements, the communists, the socialists, they arose out of the Industrial Revolution in the early 20th century or late 19th century, as anti-system movements. So their DNA is to be against the system. But what has happened to this industrial system and what has happened to the socialist movement is essentially what Francis Fukuyama called the end of history. So with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1990, basically this whole political debate in a way ended. So Francis Fukuyama talked about this as that before 1990 there was a political discussion between two opposing systems, a liberal democracy and the communist system. But after 1989 that is not a real discussion anymore. Now the world has at least kind of ideologically embraced liberal democracy and has embraced capitalism and markets as the fundamental way of governing our politics and our economy. So the whole political debate that we call the left-right dimension is basically irrelevant since 1990, and the question is, how can we then interpret these new movements and this new anti-system movement without using these perspectives that are based on a political era that was relevant when most of us grew up, but is not relevant anymore. Building on that, a lot of political science work has gone into trying to explain this and trying to look at what are kind of the new cleavages in the economy. One of the dominating views that's coming up is this kind of cultural cleavage that we've talked about today, or basically what Ronald Inglehart has called post-materialism, or the materialism versus post-materialism debate, where there is what's called the Galtan cleavage. There's a cleavage between the green, alternative, and liberal movements and the traditional authoritarian and nationalist movements, and that kind of cross-cuts the left-right dimension. So this is basically placing parties on these two dimensions, and you can see that they are basically spreading out across this. But as we've discussed, there is also a really strong geographical component to this division. So in this figure, the parties are actually placed on these two dimensions, but also a third, which is represented by color, which is the urban-rural dimension, where we have rural parties in green and urban parties in red. And you can see that basically all the rural parties are at the top here, the tan end of the spectrum, and the urban parties are at the bottom, the GAL, or the libertarian end of this spectrum. So there is also a geographical debate here, which it's difficult to explain using this distinction between materialism and post-materialism that Inglehart talks about. So I interpret this actually instead as the return of the original political cleavage that we had before the Industrial Revolution, which is the center-periphery cleavage. It's a cleavage that never really went away, but that is now really back in a big way. The center-periphery dimension is a dimension that pits centers against peripheries, and I use those terms here not strictly in a geographical sense, but they also have a geographical meaning. So it is the geographical center versus the geographical periphery. But there are also centers and peripheries within voters in centers and in peripheries. The center-periphery is essentially a debate that pits the ruling elites against the mass population. It pits the central state against peripheral regions, and what has often, I think, been overlooked in discussions about the center-periphery cleavage is that it's also about the national versus the global system, and especially in today's economy, which I'll return to later. The center is often the place where you have the international influence, the international contacts, which is part of the global system, whereas the periphery is a more national place that is more linked into national networks and has these national connections. So I would like to argue that actually the populist movements, they are representative of a new kind of anti-system wave in the periphery rather than on the right politically. And I'm glad that Jonathan already brought up Stein Rokkan. I'm Norwegian, so of course, and I was studied actually in the department that was founded by Stein Rokkan in Bergen, so I'm very inspired by his thoughts. And these are very old models for understanding how the political system worked. So Rokkan, he basically argued that the political discussion is or the political conflict is framed by different political cleavages that were formed under different phases. And essentially he divided this into one phase, which was the era of state and nation building, which fostered the center-periphery cleavage, and a second stage, which was the Industrial Revolution, which fostered the left-right cleavage and also the urban-rural cleavage. So in the Industrial Revolution, basically you created political debates between different classes, but also between the industrial workers and the agrarian workers. But before that, you had the state and nation-building era, which is essentially how did our countries, our modern democracies, our liberal nation-states come to be. They came to be because there was a core that basically occupied the rest of the territory, and they imposed their values, their laws, and their systems across the territory. And this is the era of state and nation building in mostly the 19th century, which was more or less complete in different countries, which explains why somewhere this debate has, or this cleavage has disappeared, because this was so successful, this state-building process, whereas in others it remains a salient issue. But essentially it's the central establishment basically putting its culture, its language, its laws, its system throughout the territory, and there are different systems in the periphery, different elites that were wiped out during this process, or that remain kind of political powers, and that can then respond. So you have a territorial cleavage, and you have a functional cleavage, and these populist movements are mainly reflecting the territorial cleavage. And you can see this in the common agendas that are in these populist movements. So essentially they are mainly two main tropes, I think, that unite a lot of the populist movements. One is opposition to globalization in different ways. Could be immigration, could be international trade, could be international organizations. So we've heard today about discussions over migrants, we've heard discussions over climate agreements. Of course, we know the Trump position on free trade agreements, we know the Trump position on the UN, and that's something that unites a lot of these movements. But the other is opposition to elites. Elites being the mainstream parties, but also being the media, or the mainstream media, as some of these movements would call it, and people like us, scientists, experts, which is why a lot of these movements don't believe in climate change, don't believe in the pandemic, as I'll return to, and don't believe in a lot of other things that scientists and experts are telling us. And what's the point about being in opposition to these elites is that these elites are associated with the system. So these are both ways of being opposed to the same kind of system. Now, what is this system that they are then opposing? If it's not the industrial economy, what is it? So here is where I would like to say that these movements are more similar to the left-wing movements that also caused a lot of political consternation 100 years ago than I guess we usually think. So the system used to be the industrial economy. This is what people opposed then 100 years ago. Now we are no longer in an industrial economy. We are in a knowledge economy or an information economy. So we are producing different kinds of things, and that has led to a different kind of debate and a different kind of political conflict. So this is the decline of manufacturing, which we've seen across a lot of the developed world or a lot of the Western world, where basically we hardly do any manufacturing anymore, which is the industry that is really kind of associated with the industrial economy. So the industrial economy and all of the theories of Marx was based on manufacturing industries, was based on the ownership of capital that is essential in the manufacturing industries. Today we are in a service economy where that kind of ownership of capital is not as important anymore. So this is a figure basically showing what is it that we produce. And we've gone basically from transforming materials or energy into different kinds of products through a manufacturing process to now being an economy that spends a lot of time, and especially our highest value-added activities are transforming information So communicating and storing information and computing information is essentially what we do now. So this is an information economy, essentially. That is, especially when you look at what's kind of the most high value added, what are the most valuable activities that are going on in the economy, they are related to information. And it's a global economy. So this is showing the development of international trade, which has exploded, especially since the Second World War. A little bit of stagnation at the end there with this financial crisis that we have also talked about today, but essentially the long-term picture is that this is, yes, it's an information economy, but it's also a global information economy, which is how we can also then explain, if you are opposed to the system, this is partly what you're opposed to. You're opposed to the global part of the system, but you're also opposed to a lot of kind of the values and systems associated with the information part of it, the elites, the media, and the culture, the values that those kinds of workers often have. Now, has the system failed? We've alluded a little bit to this already. Is this a system that is not working? And Andres mentioned it. I'll show you a little bit of data on this, showing that actually this is a system that is working tremendously well for most of us, right? So life expectancy has grown all over the world. The less developed countries especially picking up very, very quickly in recent decades. Economic growth growing massively, so even if maybe we're stagnating a little bit in the Western world, but globally this is a very, very positive picture where basically we've never been better off. We've never been more equal, let's say. I mean, we talk a lot about the 1%, but if you look at what the majority of the public, they're also much better off. So whereas in 1975, you can see a big lump of people globally living below the poverty line, today actually it's most of the people having incomes per capita above the global poverty line, and it's a much more normal distribution of income than it was back in 1975, for instance. This also is better. We have a more democratic world, so more and more people living in democracies. We tend, of course, to be a little bit worried whenever a country backtracks, but the long-term development is very positive. We are more peaceful, basically a lot fewer wars in the long-term perspective, and especially here fewer wars, world wars, or wars between the great powers of the world, but less conflict, I think, also overall. But this is a progress that is not completely equally distributed, and this is, I believe, where a lot of our problems are coming from. So this is a famous graph from Branko Milanovic. We've talked about crocodiles today, whereas this is the elephant graph, showing that actually, pretty much all groups in the world are better off, but there is one exception, and that is the group between the 75th and the 85th percentile in the global income distribution. That is kind of the dip there. So people who are much better off than the majority of the world, but a little worse off than the highest earners, and they are essentially our Western European or North American poor. So that is the working classes in Western Europe and North America, and that is where much of this discontent is coming from. But for most of us, this is a very positive picture. But the reason why this creates this kind of economy, the global information economy, creates a geographical cleavage is because of the very, very skewed geographical distribution of the global knowledge economy. This is data from Richard Florida on how spiky this economy is. So this is here from light emissions data, which is kind of the most comparable data from across countries. where the high peaks are the countries with the highest level of economic activity, and you can see there are very high spikes here in some parts of the world, and a lot of very flat, very kind of non-active places. And this becomes even more true if we look at more kind of knowledge-generating activities. So if we look at where people patent, if we look at the more knowledge-intensive activities, they are even more concentrated geographically. So where do people patent is extremely concentrated. Where do people publish research? Again, extremely concentrated in a few major cities. So the global knowledge economy that basically is the current system is a very skewed geographically type of system. With very clear center-periphery dimensions to it. So this is from the EU's Regional Innovation Scoreboard, where they track the innovation performance of EU regions. Here you will see the distribution in each country between different regions. And basically in every country, with one exception, which is Germany, in every country, the highest innovation performer is the national capital. And I don't want to say that this is only about the processes that are going on economically within this global capitalism, because this is also actually about the political decisions that are made. This is about where do national governments decide to invest their funds for innovation. So often you will see that the public investments are even more skewed than the private towards the capitals or towards the centers. And that is something that can more easily, I think, be or not easily, but that is something that we can actually address, because it's not about a fundamental economic dynamic. But you will see here kind of a lot of disparity within countries. Basically, pretty much all of the most innovative countries in Europe have regions that are below the European average for innovation performance. This is GDP per inhabitant, where you will also see the urban regions in pretty much every country. The blue dots here are the urban regions, being much better off than the peripheral regions. So this is what Ed Glaeser has called the triumph of the city. And the subtitle to that book is basically my bridge to discussing this in the context of the pandemic, how our greatest invention makes us richer, smarter, greener, healthier, and happier. So we've talked about how cities are richer, well, in Glaeser's word, smarter, but basically that is signifying that they are winning in this global information economy. So they are doing more of the information processing activities that are the core of our economy. Glaeser's point back then was that they are also making us healthier, which in the context of the pandemic might be something that we can qualify a little bit, as we'll discuss. But the first question is, why are central cities the winners in this global knowledge economy? And there are basically two reasons for this, which I try to show with these pictures here. The first is density. This is what a lot of the literature and research on this has focused on, that cities are very dense places. They bring together a lot of people, and they allow for face-to-face contacts. They allow for dense labor markets. They allow for sharing of infrastructure. So having a lot of people in the same place is beneficial economically, but it's especially beneficial in a knowledge economy because it allows for this kind of knowledge exchange and knowledge spillovers that this economy drives on. I'm perhaps more interested in the second dimension here, which are the international connections, which I think has been a bit overlooked in explaining the role of cities. So cities are not just kind of internally better at processing information, but they are more connected to a global network. So they actually receive more information, they receive more talent, they receive more investment, they receive more companies. This global connectedness of cities is also a very fundamental driver of their success in this kind of economy. So it's not just about the information economy part of this, but the global part is one that's also essential here. So how did COVID-19 affect this, or how did cities fare basically under COVID-19, and how did center-periphery relationships evolve is basically what I want to talk about for the rest of this lecture. This is basically showing that the two benefits that cities have in this global information economy both became disadvantages during the pandemic. So density was something that has usually been a driver of prosperity in cities, whereas in the pandemic, of course, we had to keep our distance from each other, which was much more difficult in cities. So density turned from an advantage into a disadvantage. But also the global part. So having global connections basically meant that you were more quickly affected by the pandemic, because the virus traveled also in the same global connections. So basically the two main advantages of cities, the density and their global connectedness, both turned into disadvantages during the pandemic. And this was something that we saw quite quickly in the numbers. So New York, for instance, let's say the center of global capitalism, became the worst affected region in the world in the early stages of the pandemic. So this is a graph from 18th of April 2020, quite early in the pandemic. And you can see a lot of the big cities and a lot of the globally connected cities in the core of the world being the worst affected areas in the pandemic. Around the same time, these are the worst affected regions in each country, and basically in most countries again, the worst affected areas were the national capitals. So the same cores that were at the head of economic development also now became the most affected areas in the pandemic. Of course, this changed over time. So this is some of the major states in the US. You can see the early spike in New York there, which is the solid blue line. But in later stages, New York was not the worst affected region, and there are other more peripheral regions that also had spikes. So this is essentially not about the sum outcome of the pandemic, but it's about what happened in the beginning, who were affected first, and then, of course, eventually it reached all of us, let's say. But I'm interested in essentially mainly the political fallout from this. So what happened to the politics of center-periphery relations as a result of these dynamics? And I thought it was very interesting in the start of the pandemic how a lot of countries imposed travel restrictions and basically had these conflicts between central and peripheral regions, and often following the same type of pattern where people from the center tried to escape to the periphery, and the periphery did not want to have that. So Italy, of course, quarantined the north in an early stage. In the US, New Yorkers moved often to Florida or to other kind of more less densely populated areas. In Australia, there was, and I'll show you this in a bit, the longest border closure within the country, in any country, between Western Australia, which is again a peripheral region, from the rest of the country. We had this also in Norway in two different ways. One was the northern part of the country, which imposed a ban on southerners, and the other was cabin municipalities, so where basically urban folk have their cabins, imposing bans on going to their holiday homes, basically in the countryside. And these kind of processes is basically a way of where the peripheral regions see the center and the urban regions as a threat to their own health, and then impose different kind of sanctions to prevent that. So these are examples of internal border closures, which are quite exceptional so typically we are used to having border closures between countries. Hope not so much anymore in Europe in the context of the EU, but of course that's something that we kind of quite readily consider is closing country borders. But within countries, closing regional borders is something that I don't think was really seen before this, but it's something that happened quite a lot of places. So for the US, this is a map showing US states that have or have had, so have now in blue and have had in purple, some kind of border closures during the pandemic. And as I said, the other one in Australia, where it was essentially closing off other regions from the center. So there were travel restrictions on people coming from central regions or just general travel restrictions. But you will see these are kind of also quite geographically, clearly there is a geographical pattern here where the more peripheral regions are more likely to have these kind of restrictions. Also, politically, many interesting debates, often along the same lines, between the mayors and local governments of big cities and the national governments. So these are from 6 different countries, where essentially there's the same pattern. The question is who gets to decide and who gets to set the pandemic handling policies in the city. Is it the national government or the local government? So a lot of the local governments were saying we want actually to set our own COVID policies, COVID containment policies, whereas the national government wanted often to take control over these big cities. And this is basically showing the way that this was handled in Europe, which was often through these kind of border closures as well between countries. And I think it's kind of interesting, the lack of coordination here. So in the US, this was kind of put more starkly because the states were trying to have different policies, and because the US is one country, they could more easily see that doesn't work. So one quote was having some states where it's stay at home and some places where it's not. It's like having a section in the pool where you're allowed to pee. Basically, it spreads to everywhere else. And if you have a state with very relaxed regulations for COVID, it also spreads to the rest of the country. So this was discussed in the US, whereas in Europe, of course, with the EU, you would expect the same kind of coordinated response, but essentially we saw mainly a lot of national responses to this. And then finally, the populist parties themselves and their response, which was quite stark as well, different across different countries, I would say, but a general pattern, of course, is that a lot of these populist movements did not really take COVID-19 very seriously. They did not believe in the experts also in the handling of COVID-19. So you have the most obvious examples being Donald Trump, but also Bolsonaro in Brazil. I like this picture, which might not be so representative, actually, because there is a bunch of pictures from the same press conference where the speaker takes off the mask, but he did not believe very much in masks and also not in vaccines. But also in Germany, are you satisfied with the government's handling of the coronavirus crisis? Basically, most people were, except the AfD, the populist party voters. So it's definitely something that also affected the way that you perceived this. And you can see basically a lot of these countries then coming out worst in the pandemic. Brazil and the US, for instance. Mexico, which has also a kind of left-wing populist government, I would say, are some of the countries that were worst affected in the pandemic. And some studies showing actually that countries with populist governments had much more mortality during the pandemic than the countries which had non-populist governments. And also, for instance, more mobility. So basically, the reason for the higher mortality is because they didn't have the same regulations or the same sanctions. They didn't reduce mobility to the same extent that that non-populist governments or countries with non-populist governments did. Spatial scales. So this is how populist parties approached COVID-19, often discussing kind of in-groups and out-groups. And you will see here often the in-group for these parties are in the region or in the country, whereas the out-groups are at the European or global level. So basically these countries are blaming the European Union, they're blaming China, they're blaming migrants, whereas they are protecting their local people, their local businesses, their local region. So this is how these issues are often discussed by these populist parties. But of course, the solution to the pandemic was not isolation, was not having different kind of regulations in different countries. It was fundamentally global collaboration. That was what brought us the vaccine, right? That was the result of a tremendous global collaboration that happened really quickly in the pandemic. And in a way which the science system responded, which we've never really seen before, with really kind of open data sharing, going together to solve this. And fundamentally, the way that people also responded was through this kind of solidarity. So I like this figure, which is from the US, stand together by staying apart, this kind of reflection of the solidarity that was also fundamental in solving the pandemic. So not pitting groups against each other, but through collaboration, through coming together as a society, through solving these problems. So basically, to conclude, the rise that we've seen of populism, what I've argued is that reflects the salience of the center-periphery cleavage, which we can explain from the kind of change in the underlying economy, from an industrial economy to a global information economy. The politics of COVID-19 is something that I think has strained these relationships between the centers and the peripheries. But what we need to solve this crisis and to solve other crises in the future is actually global collaboration. So this kind of response to the system is likely to make things worse. Thank you.
Thank you.